Welcome to the Notion of Life series, in which we are creating the ultimate Notion system that helps you get more results with less effort. In the last video, we had a look at the habit tracker, which is the database that helps us to create, manage, and keep track of all of our habits. And habits are basically the actions that we take on a consistent basis that help us to develop over the long term. In today's video, we are looking at the knowledge classification database. And this is basically the place where we classify all of our knowledge that does not fit under a particular project. Now, before we get started, I would like to invite you to just take a moment and reflect on the sheer amount of data, the sheer amount of information that you consume on a daily basis. And then ask yourself the question, how am I currently extracting the valuable nuggets from this ocean of information? Some practical information before we get started. You can use the timestamps down below to skip through the video. You can also increase the playback speed if you think that I'm not already talking fast enough. And all the links and assets mentioned in this video will be linked in the description down below. As mentioned earlier, we are covering the knowledge classification database in this video. Now, the key goal of the knowledge classification database is to help us organize all of our knowledge pieces that do not fit under a project. So preferably what we do is when we have a knowledge piece, we classify it under a project because that keeps it actionable. But sometimes a certain piece of information just simply does not fit under a project that we actively have going on. And in that case, we can put it in one of the knowledge classification tags. Now, we will explore later the nuances around this, when to use which database, but for now it's good to know that the key goal of this knowledge classification database, as the name suggests, is to classify knowledge. In this video, we are covering a few different chapters. The first one is a general introduction and overview about the importance of classifying your knowledge. Why do we even want to classify our knowledge in the first place? Why is it valuable to do that? Why take the time to organize our data and information? Then the second part is going to be an overview of the knowledge classification database, followed by the knowledge classification views, then the classification template, and lastly, we'll look at how the knowledge classification is used during the daily review. Let's start with a little recap and ask ourselves the question, what actually is knowledge? Now, we discussed this at length in the knowledge flow video, but let's just recap for the sake of clarity. Essentially, knowledge is the ability for us to structure the building blocks of reality in such a way that we get our desired outcomes. So, for example, let's say that I really want to build a square. Then knowledge is knowing how to put these 4 tiny squares together in such a way that I can get my desired. That is all that knowledge is. We are currently at situation A. I want to go to situation B. How do I get there? A step before that is actually knowing what pattern do I want. If I'm at point A, what should point B be? And that is where we have wisdom is knowing what pattern do I want? And then knowledge is knowing what do I actually need to do in order to get there. And then, of course, after we know what to do, what to get there, we have to execute, which is actually doing it. And then this execution and knowledge together forms our production capacity. And we discussed this at length in the project tracker video if you want to learn more about that. So in a nutshell, knowledge is knowing how to structure the objects of reality, the building blocks of reality, into the desired pattern. An important thing to understand about knowledge is that it's always embedded in a constellation of other knowledge. So knowledge never exists in isolation. It's always connected to other knowledge pieces. Simplest way to sort of visualize this is as a knowledge tree. This is an oversimplification, but hopefully it helps you to understand how knowledge is related to each other. So at the bottom, we have our deep core knowledge. These are things that are very deeply ingrained into us. Then on top of that knowledge, we build new layers of knowledge, right? We get a second branch, but this second branch is dependent on this first branch. And just like that, this third branch is also dependent on this second branch. Basically, we have this branching out of knowledge where each branch is dependent on the previous branch, right? This branch only makes sense in the context of this branch. And ultimately, all these little leaves that you see over here only make sense in their particular branch. This also means that knowledge is contextual. So, for example, this leaf over here might make a lot of sense inside of this branch, but it might be absolutely useless if we were to connect it to this branch. So like that, all of the knowledge is connected. Let's take a look at an example. This branch over here is the branch of design, right? So this branch over here is a very deep one, and it's the whole field of design. Then within this field of design, we might have a separate branch which is called visual design. Right? So design in general could mean designing furniture, it could mean designing infrastructure, but we are going one branch deeper and we're saying, okay, this is the branch of visual design, which is still dependent on the bigger branch of design. Within the second branch of visual design, we might have a concept like color theory, knowing which colors to use in design to evoke certain types of emotions. And then even more granular, inside of color theory, we might have this idea of monochromatic colors, which basically means you're using colors that have a similar shade, right? This concept of monochromatic colors is very valuable in the context of color theory, in the context of visual design, in the context of design in general. This leaf, this idea of monochromatic colors might be absolutely useless when we would relate that to something like plumbing or teaching math, right? Nobody needs a color-coded plumbing. It might be really nice to make all of your plumbing and pipes in the same color, but it doesn't add a lot of value. So this knowledge piece over here is very contextual on the branch that it lives in. So that is sort of to illustrate that all of this knowledge is connected to each other, it's embedded into each other, and it's also reliant on each other, right? So certain pieces of knowledge only make sense in certain contexts. This also means that if we were to cut a certain branch, if I were to cut this branch over here, that all the information that is living under this branch might become irrelevant, right? So we cut this branch and the information, the branches that flow out of that one die down. And the deeper the cut that we make, the more of the tree dies down. And this is what we call a paradigm shift, when there's a very deep, fundamental piece of knowledge that all of a sudden changes. And I think a very famous example is when it was first discovered that actually the sun is not turning around the earth, but the earth is turning around the sun, right? That's a very deep branch out of which a lot of different knowledge was already being built. And all of a sudden we realize this thing over here wasn't true to begin with. And that made all of this knowledge over here obsolete or wrong. And the thing with these deep shifts is that they're very uncomfortable. We don't like to go that deep. There's a reason why Socrates got executed when he just kept asking why. People don't like being confronted with the deep and uncomfortable questions. And this goes both for the questions about ourselves, right? The reflective and insightful questions, but this also goes about our knowledge. It's much easier to just say, yes, this branch exists. We know it. We've tested it. It's scientifically proven. And then sort of stilt any argument at that level. But real science, real interrogation of knowledge is actually about trying to figure out, is that thing that we believed really true? And if you look at the track record of humanity, over and over and over again, we've proved to ourselves that actually we might think something is true, and then we realize this whole branch over here turned out to be false. And that is painful, it is confronting, it is a lot of effort and energy that went into developing all that knowledge, but it's still the best thing to do because we want to operate from truth. We want to operate from reality because knowledge is about influencing reality. So we can have all the wistful thinking that we want, but if it's not going to get us to the place where we want to go, it's not true knowledge. So Always we want to try to find the deepest levels, the deepest branches, and improve the tree as a whole. Now, let's zoom in a little deeper on this idea that knowledge is contextual, that a certain leaf makes sense in a certain context, but that might be absolutely useless in another context. In one of our previous videos, in the video on the knowledge flow, we had a look at this knowledge information graph. And basically what you're seeing over here is that as the quantity of knowledge is increasing, so is the variance in the quality. And we are living in a day and age where over the past 15 years, we've almost 100-folded all of the data that we as humans have, right? So we're creating these gigantuous amounts of information. And by increasing that quantity, we are also increasing the variance between the quality. And that means that the best information that is out there now is better than ever before, more valuable than ever before. But the shittiest information is also shittier than ever before. So the gap between those two poles has increased drastically. And that means that the job that we have, the challenge that we have, the opportunity that we have is to sort of delve through this gigantuous amount of information quantity and try to find these gems for ourselves. But what we did not discover in the last video is that what is a gem is very dependent on the context in which it's used. Let's say, for example, very simple example, a PIN code, right? A PIN code to a bank account or a key to a crypto wallet. If I have a PIN code, let's say it's 4422, and this PIN code gives me access to a bank account that has €1 million on it, that is a very valuable piece of information, right? It's an absolute gem. With just these 4 numbers, like very tiny bit of knowledge, I can access this €1 million bank account or maybe this €10 million crypto key. But if I have this same knowledge, the same 2244, it looks like the same type of information, but it's not the PIN code to this bank account, it's useless. It's shit, right? It's the same piece of knowledge, but in a different context, it doesn't have that value. So this graph isn't static. It's not that a piece of information that you find inside this graph is valuable in and of itself. It's all in relationship to all of the other knowledge that we have, that things start making sense, right? This is why we use this idea of the knowledge tree. All of the information is linked to each other. It makes sense in the context of other information. Now, like I said before, this is an oversimplification because knowledge doesn't just flow in one particular branch, but actually it's all interconnected with each other in many different ways. So if we go back to that example of the monochromatic color scheme, yes, that might not be very valuable in the context of cleaning a sewer, but it might be valuable for a chef who is cooking a meal. Now, for this meal, let's say this is cooking meals, cooking vegan meals, whatever. This is the branch related to cooking food. Having that monochromatic color on the plate isn't essential to the cooking of the food, right? Ultimately, it's about the taste, but presentability also matters. So having this idea of monochromatic coloring, or maybe even just this idea of color theory, might add to the experience of this meal. And like that, all these different knowledge branches, all these different contexts have a certain level of relatability to each other. So in a certain context, it might be absolutely useless, whereas in another context, it is the most valuable thing that you could possibly have, but most of the times it's going to fall somewhere in between that, right? It has some level of value, but it's not going to be the perfect fit. If, once again, we would take something that is very complex and just oversimplify it for a moment, reality in and of itself is just a large forest of knowledge trees, and all of these knowledge trees are interrelated. They're connected to each other, and this tree is connected to that tree, and this branch is connected to that branch, and this leaf is connected to that branch and to that leaf, and they're all interconnected. And like this, reality sort of unfolds in this fractile-like fashion, right? It's infinitely becoming smaller, more branches, but it all stems from the same essence, and all of it is related to each other, and it makes more or less sense in a certain context, but it all exists within this larger context of the sum total of reality. And that's important to understand. Nothing ever exists in isolation. Then we have the second part of knowledge. So the first part is that it's contextual. The second part is that it's subjective. And this means that knowledge has different value to different people. So we could have the same piece of knowledge and we could do the same thing with this, right? We could both make this square with the knowledge pieces that we have. But maybe I am not interested in making a square. Maybe I want to make a triangle. And then having the knowledge on how to make a square isn't very valuable to me. So from my subjective point of view, for me personally, that is not very valuable. So let's go back to that example of the pin code, right? I have the pin code to get me to the place, right? I've got a 2244. And with that pin code, I can open this bank account and get 100,000 euros. Now, you might think, perfect, that is super duper valuable and that is something that I want. But maybe I am not interested in money. Maybe I'm a recluse, or maybe I think money is toxic to the mind, or whatever other reasoning I might have. Maybe I am not interested in that money. So this piece of information, even though contextually making sense, from my subjective point of view, it is not valuable. And that is where this part of wisdom is so important. Knowing what we want, what we value, what we desire, and also understanding that that is different for different people. This can help you understand yourself, but it can also help you understand other people. And if I know what you want, that can then be a piece of information that I can use to influence other people. And that is something we talked about in the Project Tracker video when we talk about social skills, influencing people, and influencing robots. Now, essentially speaking, the goal of classifying our knowledge is to take a piece of this knowledge branch and classify it in a way where it creates optimal value. And to do that, we need to understand what it is that we want. We need to have that wisdom. Then we need to know how to get there. And that is where we take this particular piece of knowledge and we use that to create the pattern that we want. And then we actually need to go and do that particular thing. We need to execute on it, because just having knowledge is not enough. We need both knowledge and execution to lead us to production capacity, right? This is our ability to produce. And to have that, we need to have these branches, and then we need to execute on them. That is why we classify knowledge. We take this information out of this ocean of data that's available to us and we turn it into something valuable. If knowledge isn't valuable, then we shouldn't bother with it. There is so much information out there, and if it doesn't create any value, just let it go, right? We'll find something that is actually valuable to us. And this is also the reason why ideally we classify our knowledge by project. So even though we're doing this whole video on the knowledge classification database, I rarely use this database. And frankly speaking, I think that already now, but especially in the next 1 to 2 years, this idea of just classifying knowledge in a static way is going to be completely automated by large language models, by AI models that can just sort of dig through this mountain of data and retrieve anything that we might need. However, knowledge is valuable if it is related to what we want, to what we desire. And the way we bridge the gap between what we desire and what we do is through the future flow, right? So inside of a notion of life, we start with insight. You can reference the Circle of Growth video to get a deeper understanding of this. And we sort of go and turn that insight into execution through planning, right? So we start with this thing that is important to us, then we set this long-term vision goal, we reverse engineer that into SMART goals, into milestones, and we end with action items. And like that, we know that I am currently executing on this thing that I know deep down to be important to me. It is bringing into alignment who we are with what we do. Principle number one, I repeat this over and over again, but it is bringing into alignment who we are with what we do. And if I know who I am and I am doing that, and now all of a sudden I find a piece of information, then of course it makes a lot of sense to classify that under this action-oriented unit. And that is where we have all the information to execute on a goal. So this information becomes very actionable, and it also becomes contextualized in our personal desires and ambitions. So that is why, usually speaking, I am a big fan of classifying knowledge by project. I understand the desire to still want to classify knowledge. And sometimes there's just this interesting thing that we encounter, or this interesting thing that we think about, that does not fit into a pre-existing project. So for those scenarios, we have the knowledge classification database. We can take a piece of knowledge, and basically what we do is just like artificially draw a box around it and say, from this entire forest of knowledge that we have, I'm just going to box off this little part and I'm going to give that a name. And this is going to be psychology, or it's going to be mathematics, or it's going to be a smaller or bigger class. And we can just sort of like box off a part of that knowledge tree. Now, the risk of classifying knowledge in this way is that we start classifying for the sake of classifying, and that we become overloaded with all of the information, because there's so much information out there. And if I'm like, hey, that's a cool branch, and that's a cool branch, and that's a cool branch, and I'm just all going to connect them to this knowledge class, and we're like starting to create this super elaborate knowledge classification, but it's not actionable, then we overwhelm ourselves without creating any value. And I see this happen a lot in sort of this productivity culture, in the Notion culture, where people just build things for the sake of building things. They're classifying things for the sake of classifying things. That is not what we're here for. We're here to create things, to create value, and to have more results with less effort. Not more effort, less results. So that is the risk. That is something that you really need to pay attention to. Does it make sense to classify this? And a sort of rule of thumb that you can use for this is that you want to know all of your knowledge classes by heart. If you don't even know your own knowledge classes by heart, then probably it's not wise to start classifying knowledge in a way. And even if you know them all by heart, really ask yourself this question: am I going to use this knowledge? Is it valuable to me? Is it actionable? And if it's not, I would seriously consider not classifying it. And like I mentioned before, I think that in the very near future, we're going to have AI models that do all this data delving for us. So if we're just classifying knowledge by a theme, we'll have AI to do that. The real interesting part is, how do we take the knowledge and make it valuable? And that is where it's contextual to these projects, to the things we value, to our action. So yeah, feel free to classify, but be wary about overwhelming yourself. If this video is valuable to you, then please like and subscribe down below. It really does help. All right, that was a lot of preamble. Now it is time to dive into Notion, because it is called a notion of life, not a talking about life of life. So let's first navigate towards the knowledge classification database, which of course lives inside of our database collection zone. And all right, let's open this one up, navigate to the master table view, and explore the different properties. So the first property is the name of the knowledge context. And as a sort of placeholder inside of this particular table, I used the 6 different life areas, which we are going to explore in a later video. And basically this context sort of describes the type of knowledge that would fall in here. And like I mentioned earlier, if you don't know these by heart, then probably it should not be a knowledge context. What I've also done is, instead of just giving things a very tiny name or label, I made them a bit more elaborate. Because if you're using tiny labels, you will notice that things start becoming bloated and complex very fast, because you have this particular piece of knowledge and then you ask yourself, does that fall under health? Does it fall under biohacking? Does it fall under fitness, under sports? Does it fall under all of those? And then we need to classify something under 4 different classifications. And like that, it becomes very complicated very fast. So instead, we take these contexts and make them slightly bigger, right? So this is the physical area, and it's everything including health, well-being, fitness, nutrition. It's the mental area, including learning, character building, positive psychology. So I have these slightly broader umbrellas so that it's more clear to what I would assign a knowledge piece to. So even though this maybe looks more complex, actually it helps us to have fewer classes, and the fewer classes, the better. Like I mentioned earlier, it is so easy to over-classify knowledge. So the fewer, the better. Over here, you'll see we have this one knowledge context, which is just a dot. This one we use for actually doing the classification during our daily review. I will show you later how that works, but it has a very particular purpose. So that's why we have that one over there. The next property is a formula. And what this formula does, it's basically calculating the amount of knowledge pieces that are related to this classification. So for each piece of knowledge that we relate, we will have one extra added to this relationship. Now you can just copy this formula if you want to use it, but basically it shows us in one very quick glance how many relationships each knowledge context have. So the creative area over here has 5 different knowledge pieces linked to it. And then of course, lastly, we have a relationship to the knowledge database, because that is where our knowledge pieces lives, and that is how we connect them to this classification, right? So these two databases need to be connected to each other. Simple database does what it is supposed to do, and that is all that we need. Then let's have a view at this view. And this one over here is a list view, and it's basically showing us all of our knowledge classes sorted by the amount of connections that we have, right? So we have a sort over here that says total relationships descending, meaning that the knowledge class with the most relationships is shown at the top and the one with the least is shown at the bottom. That then leads us to the actual knowledge classification page. So let's open up this creative area, and it's essentially a very simple page. What you see over here is a linked version of the knowledge database. So let me just briefly show you. We have the knowledge database. This is the database in which we store all of our knowledge, and we have a separate video on this one. And then in this database, a certain knowledge piece, like for example, this dummy entry, the great things that you do, is related to the creative area. So then inside this creative area page, what we've done is we've taken a linked version of this knowledge database. And then inside of this linked version, we say we only want to see knowledge pieces that are related to this creative area, right? So over here, the great things that you do are related to the creative area. So that would then also mean that inside of this view, we should be able to see the great things that you do. It is inside of there. And then the other thing that we did here is that we grouped this view by rating. So over here you can see we have the different rating for the knowledge pieces, whereby the most valuable knowledge pieces are on top. Those are the triple diamonds, and the least valuable ones are in the bottom. That's the single stars. And just like that, we can very easily check for this particular class. Okay, what is my most important knowledge? My most important knowledge is this book, The Lean Startup. Cool. Just see that in one overview. And then in addition, we also sorted it in such a way that the last edited knowledge piece is on top. And we do that by setting this to descending. So it means that the pieces that we've engaged with the most recently will be in the top within this little subgroup of the rating. And like that on every page. Let me go to the classification database. We have that same constellation. And inside of the template, of course, the filter is set to knowledge classification contains template. And once again, the cool thing that Notion allows us to do by then creating this template, this filter is automatically replaced by the actual name of the page that we've just created. And that is very simple how we use the knowledge classification template. All right, 2 more things before we end this video. The first one is that you can find this knowledge classification view inside of the knowledge zone. So over here we have all our knowledge pieces that are on keep exploring, on to explore, but we also have our knowledge classes. So from this particular zone, we can always enter all of these knowledge views. Then the last thing to explore is how to actually categorize our knowledge. And we do this inside of our daily review. So I'm just going to open up a new daily review over here. I'm going to call that one June 18. And then we scroll to the bottom to this empty inbox section, which is part of the shutdown routine in which we empty our inboxes. And then over here, we have our knowledge inbox. And inside this knowledge inbox, we have two different knowledge pieces. One is an interesting book that I captured today, and one is a set of meeting notes that I made today. Now, when we classify this knowledge, the ideal thing to do, like mentioned earlier, is connecting it to a project. So these meeting notes, for example, they are connected to this project of a notion of life, sales, and marketing. And the moment that I make this relationship between the knowledge piece and the project, boom, it disappears out of the knowledge inbox. However, if I want to connect something to a knowledge classification, it doesn't disappear straight away. So let's say this interesting book is related to the creative area. It stays here for a bit longer because ideally we connect something to a project. So once it's connected to a project, that is enough. But sometimes we might also want to attach it to a knowledge classification before we attach it to a project. Once again, I rarely do this, but if you want to classify things by knowledge classification, then you can first do that and then afterwards still connect it to a project, because we try to always connect it to a project. In the rare occasion where it's just something that you want to put under a knowledge classification, then you can use this dot page over here. And the moment I click it, the knowledge piece disappears. And the way we do that is by setting up this filter that says knowledge classification pieces are not allowed to be linked to this dot page. The moment they are, they disappear from this view. And the second filter is that the project tracker is empty. So the moment it is related to a project, a knowledge piece disappears. So connected to a class and a project, or connected to just a classification. So a quick recap of what we discussed in this video. The key goal of the knowledge classification database is to help us organize all of our knowledge pieces that do not fit under a project. But we preferably, very strongly preferably, do classify it under a project. We then had a long introduction and overview into the importance of classifying knowledge, in the contextual nature of knowledge, in the subjective value assigned to knowledge, and basically how all of the knowledge is embedded, is existing in a relationship to all of these other knowledge pieces. Then we had a look at the knowledge classification view, which is a list where we can see all of the classes with the amount of relationships that they have to different knowledge pieces. Then we looked at the knowledge classification template, which featured a linked version of the knowledge database grouped by their rating and then sorted by their recency. And then we ended by classifying our knowledge during the daily review. If you want to build the notion of life system from scratch using all these videos, then all power to you. If, however, you would rather just start using the template right here, right now, then you are in luck, because the Notion of Life enrollment is currently open and you can grab yourself a 20% discount code by using the link in the description down below. However, I never want money to be the reason that people cannot access my material. So if you currently cannot afford the template for whatever reason, just send me an email and we'll arrange something. If you want to follow along to this whole series, there is a playlist on my channel. You can just start at the first video. For now, I just want to thank you for watching, and remember,